The Cold War, a decades-long conflict between the two world superpowers, exhibited the struggle for ideological and economic control over the world. The 45-year-long war set the stage for the future of the world's political landscape. The US, USSR, Britain, and France all engaged in a series of proxy wars to control global economic riches and political power. A key region in this political ideological conflict was the Middle East. Because of its substantial natural resources and oil reserves, controlling the territory would provide vital advantages to both the West and the USSR. The USSR, US, and Britain's economic recovery after World War II depended on the region's oil, which led to the Western and Eastern nations quickly turning against each other. Soon, the region became a battleground and the Middle Eastern nations were slowly pulled into the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Middle East wanted no part in Cold War-era global warfare. Instead, many local actors in the Middle East pursued their own interests and asserted their own agendas by aligning with the superpowers. However, foreign intervention escalated pre-existing tensions in the region. This was not accidental. The superpowers strategically took advantage of long-standing feuds in the Middle East to gain control of the regions. Western powers wanted to control the Middle East because of its economic value and to prevent the USSR from gaining access to the region. The USSR similarly wanted control of the Middle East for economic power and in order to create a pro-Soviet buffer zone to protect their western and southern borders. With the US siding with conservative states like Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and the Soviets siding with Egypt and Syria, these superpowers also wanted to prevent the disputes from hurting their own interests. The USSR and USA interference in the region caused catastrophes that people in the Middle East still live through today.
Today, we will analyze the development of the Arab-Israeli conflict through the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. In 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration during World War I in order to establish a national home for the Jewish people in the land of Palestine. In 1947, the United Nations made a resolution to officially split Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state. However, the Arabs objected because they believed Israel and Zionism was another example of Western imperialism. This move signified the beginning of the Arab-Israeli conflict that persists to this day. The Soviet Union, United States, and UK supported the creation of Israel as an independent country, but the Soviets later endorsed Arab positions. This led to the divide in which Israel aligned with the West, while Arab nations aligned with the Soviet Union. The UK and the US worked to create an anti-Soviet Middle Eastern pact, but failed to pass Egypt's leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser wanted Arab states to refrain from picking a side in the Cold War and instead create productive relations with both. Nasser's agreements with the Soviets for over $200 million in weapons and aid led the US and the UK to entrench themselves completely in the Middle East during the Cold War as their fear of Soviets gaining an advantage in the Middle East grew. Tensions rose between Israel and Arab states from their second war, the Suez Crisis. The Suez Canal, key for international trade for the Cold War superpowers, was seized by former Russian General Secretary of the USSR Khrushchev through President Nasser. With help from Ukrainian soldiers, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956 and allowed the Soviet Union to take more control over the Middle East. Israel, backed by the UK and France, invaded Egypt, but both the US and the USSR condemned this attack. The UK and France left empty-handed, and the US became the only superpower against the USSR. This conflict in the Middle East was the critical point where the superpowers were reduced to the US and USSR. This left the Arab nations and Israel to pick their separate sides and further divide themselves.
In 1957 and 58, Eisenhower created the Eisenhower Doctrine with the intention of creating an alliance with more conservative Arab states who were willing to side with the U.S. during the Cold War. However, this later collapsed, especially after Iraq's pro-Western monarch was overthrown by nationalists. Starting in 1962, countries like Britain and France pulled out of Middle Eastern territory, and increasing local disputes led the U.S. and USSR to feel an obligation to expand their involvement in the Middle East. The divide in Middle Eastern allyship between the USSR and USA created the Arab Cold War, which pushed the Arab nations to attack Israel in the brief but catastrophic Six-Day War. This also caused the superpowers to be drawn deeper into the region. Overconfident of their military power, the Arab nations were certain of victory over Israel and felt the nation would surrender. Leading up to the war, Palestinian nationalists shelled Israeli borders and Nasser blockaded Israel's control over the Strait of Tiran. This caused Israel to respond violently. On June 5, 1967, Israel attacked Egypt's aircrafts, invaded the Sinai Peninsula, and killed, captured, or kicked out Egyptians occupying it. Israel then captured the West Bank, part of Jordan, and the Golan Heights in Syria. In response, the Soviet Union stepped in and gave air protection to the Egyptians. The war caused the USSR and the US to both agree on a quick ceasefire. From June 8th to 10th, Israel continued to take territory until threatened by the USSR and pressure from the US to stop. However, the end was a total loss for the Arab nations as Israel kept their new territory and the USSR kept providing military aid to Egypt and Syria for control over the Middle East. Only in 1982 did they give back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt and the Gaza Strip in 2005. Israel's pride grew, and Arab nations banded together to make the resolution, no peace, no recognition, and no negotiation with Israel, which feelings still hold today.
Will Saudi Arabia go to war against Israel?
We
are ready to go to the furthest extremity, war.
Could I ask His Majesty what sequence of events he would like to see now in the Middle East?
The first thing is the extermination of Israel.
After the defeat of Nasser, Palestinian nationalism and political Islam started to grow. And after 1967, the superpowers during the Cold War started to officially choose their sides. Soviets aided Egypt and Syria in repairing their military, while the US replaced France as Israel's main arms suppliers. In 1969, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, supported with military aid by Soviet Russia, was formed for Palestinian nationalism. They launched attacks in Israel, calling for Israel's dismantlement. By the 1970s, the superpowers during the Cold War were already deeply involved within the Middle Eastern geopolitics, and even though both the US and Soviets voiced their support for Arab states to recognize Israel, they continued to abet in Arab-Israeli conflicts for their own advantages. And in 1973, USSR-backed Egyptian and Syrian forces launched an attack on Israel using USSR weaponry. Both Syria and Egypt hoped to avenge their defeat in the Six-Day War. This conflict was called the Yom Kippur War. The turmoil threatened to bring the US and USSR into direct conflict. Although initially caught off guard by the Syrian and Egyptian attack, Israeli forces soon dominated the conflict, driving back the Syrian forces and cutting off the Egyptian troops. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, along with Soviet counterparts, arranged a tenuous ceasefire that was threatened when Israel refused to stop attacking the cornered Egyptian troops. The USSR, in turn, threatened unilateral action against the US-backed Israel. The Soviets backed down, but US-USSR relations were seriously damaged. This Yom Kippur War reflects the extent to which the US and USSR affected Middle Eastern policy. Finally, around 1977, US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger proposed a settlement between the Arab-Israeli disputes named the Camp David Accords. This is where Egypt recognized Israel in exchange for Israel's complete withdrawal from Sinai. This put an end to Arab nations who previously seek to take back land from Israel, and also the alliance between Soviets and Egypt. Egypt then became attached to the US, receiving almost the same amount of aid as Israel from the United States. Though this put a temporary end to the Arab-Israeli conflicts during the Cold War, the constant manipulation, instigation, and taking advantage of local conflicts of and in the Middle East by the two superpowers for their advantages led to further chaos and wars for the decade to come in Israel-Arab nations.
Cold War era interventions of the USSR and the US in the Middle East continues to affect its modern political landscapes. The conflict line in Middle Eastern geopolitics reflect the legacy of superpower proxy wars. While the Cold War certainly exacerbated and complicated these tensions, it is important to understand that they do not solely originate from the Cold War. The role colonialism and imperialism played in creating these issues is undeniable. To hone in on the continued effects of U.S. involvement on Israel and conversely USSR support of Palestine and Syria, the Israeli-Arab conflict is as contentious and fraught today as it was during the Suez Crisis, Six-Day War, and the Yom Kippur War in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The conflict manifests today in the Gaza-Israeli conflict. The dispute has left thousands of Palestinian citizens dead. Israel forces have used extreme violence against citizens, and the Israel Defense Force has used inhumane strategies to target civilian infrastructure. The military strength and capacity of Israel shown in the Six-Day War is still present and continues to grow to this day. The remaining Palestinian settlement of the West Bank and Gaza Strip has seen to increase of surveillance from the Israeli government, which is backed by the U.S. and other nations as Israel is internationally recognized as a country. Under the pretext of security, Palestine lives have been dictated and controlled by military checkpoints and a wall that has divided families. From the UK creation of the Israeli state in 1848 through Cold War era escalations on both the US-Israeli side and the USSR-Arab side, it is obvious that European superpower interventions has influenced the Israeli-Arab at every level of the conflict.